We all know by now that inflation is a very hot topic. For the last 2 to 3 years, we've talked about it being our number one emerging global risk. And we've seen it really hit home in the real economy and financial markets in the last 6 months or so. The risk inflation poses to long-term savings should not be underestimated. Inflation of just 5% will halve your capital in less than 15 years. Investors ignore inflation risk at their peril. But before we get into it in more detail, let's go back to around 2010 when the world was emerging from the death throes of the global financial crisis. Central banks and governments had resolved to do everything possible and more to prevent the onset of a full-blown depression and to ward off any prospect of deflation, which for governments that like to borrow is the ultimate enemy. As the truism goes, inflation is the enemy of the poor, but deflation is the enemy of the indebted. What ensued was a decade-plus long everything rally, as we like to call it. Any hint of financial risk or economic slowdown was met with the full force of accommodative central bank and government policy. Now, the really anomalous part is that the world enjoyed this long period of solid economic growth with absurdly low interest rates and no hint of inflationary pressures. The world was enjoying the benefits of decades of globalization efficiencies, relatively stagnant wages, the Wall Street versus Main Street dichotomy, and a general era of supply exceeding demand in almost all goods and services. But this surely could not go on forever. Fast forward to where we are today. It is now clear that most of the world is in a synchronized rising inflation cycle, and the major central banks are properly behind the curve, just as they told us they would be. Inflation expectations have moved up, and expectations are way more important to financial markets than the actual reported historic inflation numbers. And if expectations continue to rise and the Fed continues to talk tough, further market volatility should be expected. So where did the current inflation surge come from? Well, when COVID lockdowns shut most economies, governments responded with massive monetary and fiscal support to households and businesses. In many instances, it was literally checks in the mail. This support totaled around $17 trillion in the pandemic period alone, which is equivalent to roughly 16% of the size of the world economy. So the developed world, and particularly the United States, was flooded with liquidity in the form of unprecedented money printing and stimulus checks, which increased the total dollars in circulation by an historic 30%. Now, this free money was used mostly to buy goods. As a result, US retail sales in 2020 and 21 grew around 10% per annum, which was much faster compared to the prior decade's growth of around 4% per annum. Now, history has told us that when disposable income grows much faster than nominal economic growth, it is usually followed by a period of rising inflation. And while consumers went on a shopping spree, many factories shut down due to COVID-19 regulations and protocols. This resulted in a major pressure buildup in the global supply chain. So, quite simply, demand increased, but supply shrank. And although governments have started to rein in the free money, the demand for goods and services too has stayed strong. The consumer is still strong because the labour market is tight and getting tighter. In short, more people are employed and they are earning more. Surprisingly, the Federal Reserve has not responded to the strong labour market with higher interest rates, which is very different from previous cycles. In the past, the Fed started hiking rates quite early when the labour market started to gain momentum. But because the Fed worried that inflation was only transitory, it held back on hiking rates in 2021. So it strikes us that they may make two mistakes in a short space of time. Firstly, it did not hike rates when it should have. And secondly, it may continue to hike rates even after the labour market loses momentum, which is something that we have not seen before. So, that is how the inflation genie escaped the lantern. And we don't think it's going away anytime soon. As we have said all too often in the last 10 years, we seem to be in uncharted territory here. And the rearview mirror is a dangerous place to be looking.